Tyres have been a big talking point over the last 15 years or so, which tells you two things. Number one, it tells you how long Pirelli has been supplying tyres to Formula 1, and number two, it makes you wonder where the time has gone. This year it will be 10 years since Jules Bianchi died, and I'm refusing to believe it. But how did Formula 1 reach this point in the first place? Where's the good old days of tyre wars and names like Goodyear and Bridgestone and companies like that? Well, I'm glad you complained, because it was simply a matter of how things were going at the time the different manufacturers pulled out. Goodyear left the sport in 1998 partly as a protest. As mentioned 997 times by now, the tyre war between Goodyear and Bridgestone had resulted in ultra-durable tyres. Well, unless it's Goodyear at hot tracks, it seemed, that were also incredibly grippy. Braking distances had shrunk, times were staying faster for longer, and for the FIA it was too much, and things needed reeling in. This was just 3 years after Imola 1994, and Formula 1 was still on a safety rampage. When Villeneuve's pole time for the 1997 Australian Grand Prix is 3 seconds faster than his 1996 Australian Grand Prix pole time in a car that was only a small upgrade from the previous year's car, something had to be done. So when the FIA said that Bridgestone and Goodyear had to cut grooves into the tyres for 1998, 3 in the front and 4 on the rear to reduce mechanical grip, Goodyear was not happy. They were in Formula 1 to push the limits of what a tyre could do. They were in it for engineering excellence, and those grooves were interfering with the development they wanted to do, so they pulled out. Bridgestone became the sole supplier through 1999 and 2000, with Michelin returning to the sport in 2001. From there were several controversies, including but not limited to the fiasco surrounding the illegal tyres from 2003 that had been used for a very long time without complaint, but were now under investigation for some reason. Michelin's sidewalls were flexing too much and the tyre moved around too much, providing more grip than it probably should. Many think that without this controversy, Montoya would have been closer to the championship than he ended up being. Then there was that race at Indianapolis in 2005, when Ralf Schumacher's Toyota suffered a catastrophic failure in the banking and ended up slamming into a wall. This prompted safety concerns, and Michelin were accused of building an unsafe tyre. But part of it was, Michelin had built a tyre to go through every single corner except one unique corner at one specific track. There's actually more to all of this which we'll need doing again at some point, because the video on the 2005 US Grand Prix was one of the yeeted videos from 2020. So Michelin went at the end of 2006 and Bridgestone stuck around until the end of 2011. Bridgestone then left, citing the economic downturn as one of the reasons for them leaving. So the tender was opened and Pirelli was selected to supply the tyres from 2011 onwards, and the 2011 season will be the first time that Pirelli will be on the grid since 1991. Pirelli came onto the grid, and for a lot of people it was a bit weird. The Bridgestone slicks and the Bridgestone branding was all gone and been replaced by the yellow branding of this Italian tyre company. I remember at the time there was a lot of discussion about how the tyres had been constructed, because there'd been a lot of mention of tyre rules with their introduction. Much like the previous Bridgestone years, some of the rules had carried over. Back in the days of the grooved tyres and then into the later Bridgestone years, you might have seen that some of the cars ran tyres with a white stripe down the middle. This was to tell the FIA and the viewers at home that the driver was running the softer tyre and they had to run both compounds during the race weekend, as opposed to the tyre war years where it was pick the compound you're going to use, and once you've used it in qualifying, you're locked in for qualifying and the race. No changing. If you've played F1 1997, Martin Brundle mentions it several hundred times a race. Hards are more durable but slower, but softs are faster but will run out faster, so you might have to consider an extra pit stop depending on the conditions. As well as Brundle saying that the tail end teams have to sharpen up their act. How did that line get through quality control? But then again, standards have improved since 1997, haven't they? Well, sort of, because how many games these days are released as buggy messes as early access? There were two tyres in 2010, the Prime tyre and the Option tyre. The Prime was the slower and harder of the two, and the Option was the softer tyre that was faster. The idea was you ran them until they wore out, and at the optimal crossover point, you swapped them over and continued, with Bridgestone's degradation seemingly consistent in terms of the lap time that dropped off. It's probably why the viewers keep wishing for those days back, but like a lot of things with F1 fans, it's probably just nostalgia. But with Pirelli, we were going to have 4 types of dry compound tyres, super soft all the way up to hard, and they would switch up which tyres they would bring to each Grand Prix depending on the nature of the track. So for street circuits or low degradation circuits, they would bring the softer tyres, but for high degradation circuits, they'd bring the harder tyres. On top of this, from the very outset, we kept hearing about something called the Cliff. So who is Cliff? Well, he was my dad's dad. No, sorry, what is the Cliff? As mentioned before, as the tyres degrade, you're going to lose lap time. The tyres might be pretty good for the first 4 laps or so where you hit your peak lap time, and assuming the driver himself is pretty consistent, you're going to get, well, consistent lap times. Let's say, for instance, that the driver goes out and as he builds heat and temperature in, he starts on a 1 minute 22.3. He then does a 22.1, 21.8, and then on the 4th lap with everything at its peak, he does a 21.5. After which, the tyres start to drop off. Thermal degradation and scrubbing the tyres across the tarmac will do that. So now he's doing 21.7, 21.7, 21.8, 21.7, 21.8, 21.9, 21.9, and then holds it around the 21.9, 22.1 mark. He'll probably drop a little bit further into the 22s after about 15 laps or so. Then on lap 18, which is just a number I've picked off the top of my head, he then does a 23 dead or a 23.1, which is a lot slower than what he was doing before, and he's done nothing different. Well, that's the Cliff, and it just means that the tyres are past their sell-by date and for all intents and purposes, useless. Got to get rid of them, got to change them, get on some fresh rubber, get that lap time back. But the thing is, these Cliffs weren't because Pirelli was making terrible tyres. You know, I mean, like they weren't making them because they're a terrible company. This was all part of the whole "we need to spice up the racing" thing. Pirelli had built their tyres to a brief set out for them, and on top of this, they were in their first season since 1991, so it had been almost 20 years out of the sport when they returned. Pirelli was also building their tyres around the KERS and DRS systems, and with all 3 pieces of technology working together, it was hard to find a balancing act. At the start of the 2011 season, Pirelli was accused of making the tyres too fragile, so when they introduced a new spec later on in the season, they were criticised for going too far the other way. With it being their first season back, they still had some learning to do. For 2012 though, things changed. Pirelli made changes to all 4 dry compounds to try and get the right balance of performance and show. And the thing is, for a while, it looked like it was working. The goal was to make the performance difference between the 4 dry compound tyres closer initially, and then having them degrade at different levels based off what compound they were. Pirelli also changed how the contact patch at the rear worked in anticipation of the downforce drops for the start of 2012 because the blown diffusers had been outlawed. The issue that Paul Hembry and team had was they were making tyres for 12 teams, 24 cars and 20 different circuits. Having them work perfectly at every race was going to be a tall order, if not impossible. And the teams asked for this. As mentioned, the blown diffusers were gone, so having a tyre that worked better under acceleration and didn't get spun up and ruined as quickly was going to be better overall for the drivers to drive, and also better for the teams in terms of setup. They could set up the car as they normally would, without them having to compromise lap time for extended grip, which is also better for the people watching at home because, as we keep seeing at Monaco, lapping 3 seconds slower than normal to ensure a one-stopper since no one can overtake is like watching paint dry. The rear tyres were squarer than before, and distributed load more evenly over the contact patch, which should have helped reduce blistering when they got hot, so the tyre can run at its optimal for longer without the actual lifespan of the tyre being affected. In theory, they should have lasted about the same amount of laps as before, but had a bit more time in the tank for a couple of extra laps. And other changes to the tyres meant that the time offset between the 4 compounds, so super soft, soft, medium and hard, dropped from between 1.2 and 1.8 depending on the circuit, to less than a second. So a second over the 4 compounds, not in between each one. In theory, it meant that the drivers could stick any set of tyres on and there wouldn't be a massive gulf in performance. A driver on the softs wasn't going to naff off into the distance while someone on hards ran 1.5 seconds a lap slower. Because overtaking and all of that. But there was still the dreaded Cliff, which Kimi Raikkonen found out about at the Chinese Grand Prix. Due to the way Pirelli had constructed the tyres over their first season, the general way of thinking was 3 stops, with teams having to use both compounds in the race. While the gap between the tyres had reduced, 3 stopping was still the way forward, and tyre-saving exercises seemed to be the best way of doing things, with drivers not quite able to push as hard as they might otherwise would have wanted to. But at least it's better than fuel-saving races like Hockenheim used to be in the good old days. Kimi had tried to go for a 2-stopper in China, and for a while it looked like it was going to work, much like George Russell at Spa last year before he got disqualified. But the problem was, with about 10 laps to go, Kimi hit the cliff, and he was lapping so slowly once he hit that cliff, he went from 4th down to 14th, and finished 50 seconds behind eventual race winner Nico Rosberg. But while the tyres were producing different winners and mixing things up every race, there was still the criticism that the tyres weren't lasting as long as they probably should have done. Rosberg and Schumacher had started that Chinese Grand Prix on the yellow-walled soft tyres, as was, and Rosberg was able to get them to lap 14 of the 56, while Webber, Button, Raikkonen and a couple of others were pitting on lap 7 to get the safer 3-stop strategy, although Raikkonen reverted to a 2-stopper. Vettel, who pitted twice, lost out to Button and Hamilton late in the race as his tyres died in the same way that Raikkonen's had. Rosberg had said that the 2012 tyres were good for the sport, but then again he just won the race, so of course he would have done. If you were to look at the opening 5 races and see that there were 5 different winners, you'd go, wow, that's cool, I'll watch this. The already mentioned concerns were already there. Schumacher said the tyres were not fun to drive on, and would have spoken from his experiences of getting Bridgestones tailor-made to his Ferraris for so long. Paddy Lowe, who was at McLaren at the time, said that seeing a rival blast by your car because your driver has worn or harder tyres isn't exactly thrilling or takes any skill, while Mark Webber said that fighting was pointless because as soon as you fought, you chewed the tyres up. But on the other hand, Mark Hughes at Autosport said that so long as the show is good, then what's the problem? Endurance driving added an extra element of skill to things that hadn't been part of the sport for so long, thanks to the durable tyres of the past. Meanwhile, I've dug up some old Autosport forum and Reddit posts from the time saying, "Give me the real F1 back, they used to drive at 100% all the time." But they didn't. Turbo years were fuel-saving exercises. Refueling years you just waited until the pit stops to overtake. And tyre and fuel saving could be done back in the refueling years as well to change the strategy up if they had to. Schumacher was the only driver who openly said that these tyres were crap. Martin Brundle, who had now gone to Sky Sports from the BBC, had said that another world champion had also said that these tyres were crap. Now I'm thinking it was Alonso, but at the same time, it could have also been Hamilton. It seems that while there were those slagging these tyres off, there was an equal amount of people saying that they were enjoying how messed up the season had been by this point. After that same Chinese Grand Prix that Rosberg won, 9 of the 12 teams had points on the board, which, let's be honest, was all the teams that was going to score points that year. By the third round of the 2024 season, 7 of the teams had scored points, leaving 3 yet to score, and those 3 teams could have scored points, and the driver standings was incredibly close in 2012 as well. But just around the corner was a massive conspiracy. The Pirelli lottery conspiracy became a thing just after Pastor Maldonado won the Spanish Grand Prix. By this point, there had been 5 different winners in the opening 5 races, and with Webber winning Monaco and Hamilton winning in Canada, that would put it up to a record-breaking 7 in 7. While the tyres were shaking things up and we had a close season and different winners and the order shaken up every race weekend, there was no consistency. A team or a driver could have an amazing race one weekend and then be nowhere at the next one. Jenson won at Melbourne but was then 14th in Malaysia. Alonso won in Malaysia but was then 9th in China. Rosberg won in China but was then 5th in Bahrain. Vettel won Bahrain but was then 6th in Spain, and so on. Now this does have some crossover with the video that I did on the 2012 Spanish Grand Prix, and after Maldonado won that race, the conspiracy was that Pirelli was making dodgy tyres and then handed better ones to the driver they thought should win the race, because another few years like the Schumacher years of the early 2000s wasn't going to be a good look, especially since Vettel had just dominated the previous year. So if they could essentially rig races to jumble things up, Formula 1 would look better and attract more fans. It just so happened that on this occasion, Pirelli's random number generator had picked Williams and Maldonado to win. It was also seen as being convenient because it was Frank's 70th birthday that weekend, and supposedly the Venezuelan president had a hand in this as well. Because, at least the thinking amongst the fans was, there's no way a Williams should be winning races. And supposedly all of this started on Spanish message boards. Who finished second in that race? Fernando Alonso. These same message boards also claim that the fire that happened in the Williams garage after the race was Williams trying to destroy any evidence. This being the same Spanish message boards that started the Glock was paid to take a dive conspiracy. But for all the drop-off, the falling off the cliff, the conspiracies, the complaining and everything else besides, it seemed that at some races you could take the punt on the extra pit stop and end up winning the race, instead of taking the punt on doing fewer stops and losing the race. At the Canadian Grand Prix, Hamilton committed to a 2-stopper with about 20 laps to go, and because of his pace, he rejoined after his second stop 9.5 seconds behind Vettel and 13 behind Alonso. Because Vettel and Alonso wouldn't be able to pit and get out ahead of Hamilton, they stayed out, hoping that something might happen where they might get a free pit stop. Montreal was an exception to the general rule of 3 stops, since it's a low degradation circuit. Grosjean had done the same thing and was closing in on the leading cars. Hamilton, meanwhile, was gaining on Alonso and Vettel at a rate of over a second a lap, and then both the Ferrari and the Red Bull hit the cliff, losing 3 seconds a lap. Vettel realised he had to pit and rejoined in 5th. Alonso didn't pit at all and was actually overtaken by Vettel with 2 laps to go. That might have been as much of a turning point in the 2012 season as the first corner pile-up at Spa did, although that's something that I might need to look at in the future. Was it Spa or was it this that, undid the championship for Ferrari and Alonso? But either way, it was so messed up, that Canadian Grand Prix, that the podium was Hamilton, although, okay, it's Hamilton and he's in a McLaren, he probably should be winning races, but in second was Grosjean, in third was Perez in a Sauber. Tyres, innit? Pirelli's tyres at this time essentially fixed the stint lengths, unless the drivers were willing to slow down a bit and eke out a couple of extra laps. The cliff causing drivers to lose up to 3 seconds a lap was essentially, you need to pit, and it was somewhat of a novelty that wore off after the 2012 season, since you kind of knew when everybody was going to pit with no overcut or undercut, since everybody was going the same distance. After which, the calls came for Pirelli to build a tyre that had less of a drop-off and more of a naturally progressing fall-off in lap time. There would have to be a cliff eventually, but having that cliff much later on so that the teams had maybe 3 or 4 laps of wiggle room to switch up the strategies might have helped. But during the 2013 season, Pirelli had to make sweeping changes after several high-speed blowouts at Silverstone, reverting to a spec of tyre that suited the Red Bulls best, and Vettel went on to have a then record-breaking run towards the end of the year. Since then, the tyres have improved in terms of how long they can go, but they're still not perfect. And this has also knackered Pirelli's reputation. The way that Pirelli's Formula 1 tyres work has got people saying that they won't buy Pirelli's road tyres as a result, but it seems that they're damned if they do, and damned if they don't. I guess it's one of those things. Do you have tyres that last forever so that people can set blistering lap times lap after lap after lap after lap? Or do you have to have them fall apart after a certain time to make things a little bit messed up for TV? It's a difficult balancing act, and I'd like to know what you think down in the comments. So then, a look at Pirelli's tough times through the 2011 and 2012 seasons, with the cliff essentially setting fixed stint times. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates, and any other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there if you want to do a one and done donation or top up my coffee cup, which is, you've probably seen it. It's a mighty big coffee cup. And there's memberships if you want to do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.